Okay, so how are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Yeah, it's been quite a day. So I wanted to bring you on specifically because I was curious about your mission as it seems right now. You seem to have this
hmm
divine quest to do a long-winded sort of recorded video on every single monster that has ever appeared in this game. What
Yeah,
what spurred you on to do something like this?
it's kind of like it's a very organic sort of way that my channel has grown to being what it is, and part of it, about 90% of it, is feedback from people who are watching me and listening to me and telling me what to do. So I started out. The reason why my channel is called the Mighty Glue Stick is I get asked this a lot. Is because I started off as a crafting channel. I was following in the footsteps of DM Scotty and Gareth over in Australia, the GMG Info, Wylock Crafts, Black Magic Crafts, those guys. And I was making cardboard, very cheap terrain. And my special shtick, which was slightly different from everybody else's, I hated painting cardboard. I found it warped and was really crappy. And what I would do is I would print out maps, and then I would cut out the maps and I'd build them up in sort of relief, making these cheap dungeon tiles. And that worked out really well. Also, I've always had a passion for sculpture, so I would make miniatures, and I'd make miniature terrain, just out of plasticine and Sculpey and green stuff and all that sort of thing, using, again, sort of cheap and easy techniques and showing people how to do it. But one day, I was making a roper miniature, just out of like toilet roll and some twine and stuff. And Gareth, over in Australia, said, "Why don't you talk about the monster while you're crafting it and tell people about the lore and history of the monster while you're doing it?" And it just all started from that. So from then on, I just shifted more and more away from crafting and more just talking about the lore of monsters. And it became something that I discovered that I have an absolute boundless passion for, and also some relevant skills from my old profession of being a lab rat. So yeah, actual I do dungeons ecologies and monster ecologies, but I've actually been trained in biological science and stuff as well, so I've got a background in it.
I mean, when we DM, we always bring like our outside skills to the table, so
Absolutely.
people tell me like, my profession is I work in politics. So when I do a political intrigue campaign, they're like, oh, this is much more than I thought I would be getting into. And because I,
Right.
I bring up like obscure ministers and all that. So here's a question. So you just recently finished the official monster manual,
hmm
and you've begun doing your most recent was the deep spawn, I'm correct, right?
That's right. Yeah. Real
So
old school monster.
so that's from AD&D 2, I think, or 2.5.
That's right. Yeah. Yes, it's had a little bit of third edition stuff. Nothing in fourth edition. Certainly nothing in fifth edition.
Mm.
Yeah.
So my question is do you plan to go on to any specific books after this? Like you're going to specifically go on to Morden Canaans, or are you just going to now have it be more of an eclectic mix?
The thing is, it's always been quite an eclectic mix of, as I say, I've really been driven by what people ask me to do, and I have a huge list of requested videos that I work my way through, at my own sort of pace. My I've got an unlimited amount of content that I can work with and make. So I've got all of the books from Kobold Press. I've got Creature Codex and Tome of Horrors from Frog God Games. I've got all of the even Acquisitions Incorporated has got some creepy stuff in there, which I can bring to the table. Also, I do other stuff as well as just monsters. So working through character classes and races and things very glacially slowly, because I feel a lot of pressure to get those absolutely right. So when I talk about warlocks and stuff, I don't want to be called out by somebody who knows more about warlocks than I do. But when I go into making these videos, um, I tend to sort of follow my own interests and follow a theme, and it just sort of coincides that I just happened to work my way through the entire monster manual. So I wasn't working solidly A to B to C to D. So as you go through the playlist of all those videos, they actually cover a wide span of a few years, where some reasonably recent videos will be forward in the playlist from other ones. So it's not following in alphabetical order. And that was mainly just following people's requests and my own interests.
So you said you started out doing cardboard miniatures, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about, like, how do you think, you know, you are as a DM now compared to way, way back, even before the cardboard miniatures when you first started? Like, how do you see yourself? How do you see your growth and timeline as a DM?
So doing it intensively, like doing it as a profession, so concentrating on D&D every single day. I remember how I was when I started out doing these videos. I was a bit sketchy on some of the rules. Fifth edition was just sort of had just come out, so I during the video on Angels, for instance, I had like a printout of fifth edition, which was D&D Next as it was known back then, and so I've sort of grown with fifth edition and this intensive study of all the different lore and stuff, and having a much better understanding of how the game has developed over the years. So I also get a hell of a lot of feedback from people who watch my videos who say how much their game has improved through just immersing themselves in the lore of Dungeons and Dragons. Not just the mechanics of it, but the actual feel of these fantasy worlds and how they all fit together. Because you can't help but pick up a lot of not just inspiration, but also a broad understanding of how the Forgotten Realms is situated, what sort of creatures there are, why those creatures exist there, how they sort of interact and interplay with each other, how civilizations work amidst all of this monster mayhem, and the fact that there are equally powerful forces of good against all this evil as well. It's just that it's less talked about because it's less juicy to fill the pages of monster manuals.
Yeah,
So
you know
my
you're
own
fighting them.
yeah, it'll be a bad idea to fight the Celestials, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So my own personal growth, not only just a better understanding, because I really went into this wanting to know all about Forgotten Realms and having being able to study it like the rich body of lore that it is, and give it the proper respect that it deserves, because it's 40 years of collective story writing from some of the best authors in the world. So it's not... when I present the lore, I'm not presenting it as I'm not telling people how to play their game. I'm telling people what the game has been and what has been produced for it. When it gets to their gaming table, I have no opinion on their game at all. However they want to run their game is entirely their business, and I won't gatekeep anybody. That's not what I'm there for. I'm there to present the lore and preserve it and cherish it, but I'm not there to enforce it on anybody. Yeah, very much so. So I'm quite open to people having conversations with me about their homebrewed worlds and their homebrewed rules as well at their table. I'm always interested in finding out what people's solutions are to different situations.
Now, I am kind of curious, like, you're taking on what seems to be this very massive task. Like, how do you not burn out from, all the content you're putting out compared to, someone who, like me, puts out a video like once every week or two?
Right. So I think the main thing is that I'm a professional YouTuber. I do this for a living now. This is my sole form of income, and it's my sole focus. So I could actually put out more videos, but I don't. I tend to just sort of relax and have a very good work-life balance. What I do is I've got a process that I follow where I'll put out a video and then I'll basically relax for a day, and towards the end of that day I'll start really thinking about the next video and start planning and working on it, and then the research sort of kicks in, I start gathering images and researching stuff and pouring through books and wiki articles and old magazines and things like that until I've got all the material that I need. And then I start writing way into the early hours of the morning. And generally speaking, by the time I've recorded, edited, and put the video up, it's my time is it's about 1 or 2 in the morning, which is about morning time over for my audience in the States, because I'm in New Zealand, so obviously I don't sync up very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's now about 8 o'clock in the morning over here, and I've been up most of the night working on my next video, which is going to be aboliths. That's another point I was going to get to as well, is that I'm updating a lot of those videos as well, because when I started out, I didn't really take it as seriously as I do now. So the quality of my earlier videos, although they're still pretty good in their own right, the audio issues, and I didn't have the same sort of art style and presentation style, and I didn't have written scripts for them. I was just talking off the top of my head sort of thing after reading about them. These days I write scripts for every single video that I do, and I upload those scripts to my Patreon so that people who may have audio disabilities and things like that can actually read the scripts instead of having to listen to it. And a lot of people actually prefer just to read what I do instead of sitting there and listening to me, because they can't understand my accent.
Mm-hmm. That's fair enough.
Mm.
I am kind of curious. So, from how you sort of present your information and, given your history, you seem like someone who is very, not all DMs use the battle grid, sort of hard line.
Mm.
So I'm kind of curious, like, as someone who uses the grid and all that, how do you feel that 5.0 stacks up against earlier editions?
Well, so that's a misconception that I'm actually stuck to one particular type of play. I'm completely open to any sort of play that is applicable to whatever the group is at the time and whatever the situation is at the time. So at the moment, because I live out in the country and I've moved away from the city and away from my gaming group back home, so to speak, I do all of my regular gaming over video, over a Discord channel. And it doesn't really, I don't like using Roll20 and things like that, because I think it's just a bit clunky and difficult, and I've got a lot of other stuff to do, so I don't have time to plan out and program all of that correctly. So it's entirely theatre of the mind. So we don't use any miniatures or anything like that, which is a crime, because I have this huge collection of miniatures which I end up just lending out to all of my friends. So half of the collection is scattered across the country, being used furiously. When I do get together with people, it depends on what I have available. So I've run games where we don't have any grid at all, and I'm just putting books and pencils and bits of blue tack and things like that down. I'm quite a fast sculptor, so I can grab some plasticine and make miniatures on the spot or whatever we're using, and it's just representative. So it all comes to life in our minds and through the words and what we're doing, and it's very organic. I do also like more competitive play, and say Frostgrave and that sort of competitive play, which definitely does use grids and things. 4th edition was very grid intensive. It was quite hard to get off the grid for that, but you can still do it, and there's definite influence on the different style of play that you have depending on what you're doing representatively. So if you're using a grid, you kind of get grid tactics stuck into your head, and as soon as you get rid of the grid, the thing that I found is that people get much more swashbuckler. They're more willing to have their miniatures go up on top of tables and leap off chandeliers and swing with ropes and all this sort of thing. They just get really freewheeling, which is, I find, quite preferable. So I actually prefer gridless play in many ways.
Sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
So you come from New Zealand. So
Mm-hmm.
how do you think that the particular culture of where you come from sort of distinctifies the stories you tell and how you frame your narratives compared to, someone who's lived a different life or a different background?
It's very similar in many ways to what people would be familiar with in the States, because wherever you go in the States, you have reasonably small communities within a larger state community. So there may be millions of people around, but your social network is pretty tight. So it'll be people that a clique from high school or something like that you've gotten to know, and then when you move into a new area, you'll find somebody who shares an interest with you, and then they'll have groups of networks of friends that get together. And so gaming circles and things just are reasonably the same. I think the main difference with New Zealand is that we network very well in New Zealand. We're a very communicative bunch. We talk quite fast and we talk a lot, and we tend to gather together for social gatherings anyway, barbecues and dinner parties and things, sort of ingrained into the culture. Finding role players is reasonably easy considering our tiny population, because there's only about 5 million people in the country, the entire country, which is about the land area of Britain. So it's mountains and the occasional person. But you just use social networks, you use media, you use Twitter and Facebook groups and all that sort of stuff to find each other. You go and check at the local supermarket for the notice boards. Somebody will put like a 20-sided dice symbol on there, and your eyes just gravitate towards it and you read what they're about. And at the local community centre at the library, there's a group of D&D players who are meeting tomorrow, I believe, and there's 2 groups. It's recently exploded thanks to the popularity of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. So there's now 2 full groups of people who are playing organised play, which even 2 years ago would have been unheard of in New Zealand. But it's just, it's going crazy everywhere, to the very ends of the earth.
Well, so I'm kind of curious about that, since you bring it up, is that there has been this very recent boom in popularity. You know, in one part, thanks to 5.0 being very approachable, and then also in part to, you know, nerd culture just seeing a general boom, especially like, you know, shows like Stranger Things and Riverdale sort of having it par and parcel as part of their narrative. And then you have like, you know, big fantasy shows sort of having a small renaissance right now, like Game of Thrones. You know, it's bringing a lot of new people in the fold. You know, what do you think is the best approach to bringing people in, and you know, how do you integrate all these new people in, you know, to a community sort of harmoniously?
Well, first of all, I'd say that Dungeons and Dragons isn't a single community. That's a fallacy. It's always been a diverse range of different interests that are under the umbrella of generally role-playing games. This all comes from wargaming, after all, and there's all sorts of different types of wargames. There's people who do historical reenactments, there's people who do space, Warhammer, that sort of thing. Interesting story about the origin of Games Workshop as well. It used to be basically the UK D&D, but because of some contractual shenanigans, they ended up splitting off into a different company. So we wouldn't have had Warhammer 40k and all that sort of stuff if it wasn't for Gary Gygax getting a miniature deal with somebody else. But that's D&D history. So I would say that you've got to embrace the fact that people play quite differently, and that the people coming into the game are going to be coming from a different perspective. They're not going to be the same traditions of Dungeons and Dragons, and we shouldn't feel in any way that we need to force them into any paradigm of Dungeons and Dragons that we want to play. Really, we should be adaptable as old school players and enjoy the newness of it, because essentially we're still going to be telling the same stories. We've just got a different focus, and the different groups of people coming in, the diversity of their media background is more important, I think. Like what they've read, what they enjoy, what shows they watch, what books they've read, what comics and things like that is more important, I think, than who they are physically. Like their mental makeup is more their diversity is what I'm talking about than anything else. And I think that's what we've got to be open and accepting to. There are going to be people who want to play Dragon Ball Z in Dungeons and Dragons. There's going to be people who want, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Thundercats and stuff from the 80s, that sort of reenactment vibe going on. And we've got to accept the fact that Dungeons and Dragons has always accepted this. Like Gary Gygax wrote a very controversial module with a spaceship, a crashed spaceship, in his fantasy world. That even back then, they had traditionalists up in arms who thought the Dungeons and Dragons was supposed to be some sort of medieval Earth equivalent, but it never has been, and it never should be pigeonholed. Yeah, we should be just open and adaptable. Absolutely. That's okay. This is it in a nutshell. If your friendship with the people around the table is good, what you're playing doesn't matter. It's a social activity.
That's fair enough. Do you ever see yourself sort of expanding out with your channel and just in general, like tackling different systems, or, you know, looking at, well, I suppose you already do look at older pieces. So do you see yourself sort of expanding into, you know, new systems like, well, like 40K, for example, as you sort of 3 years from now start to run the well dry with stuff here?
I don't think I'm going to run the well dry ever. I've got 10 years worth of material to get through. I do definitely. I'm more interested in virtual reality and things like that. So if you combine the 3D modeling that people are doing for using their 3D printers at home, for instance, and producing their own terrain that way, but a digital model of something that can be used in a virtual environment. So you combine that with some heads-up goggles, some VR, you know, your HTC Vive or whatever it is, with modular 3D terrain that you can snap together on a virtual table in front of you, arrange the lighting, arrange your encounter points by just pointing and clicking, with your catalogue of monsters, which are represented in pictorial miniature form beside you, so you can just literally pick from a massive array of them. And then once the game starts off, you stay in spectator dungeon master mode, looking for the bird's eye view of everything going on. All the players actually go point of view as their characters. So they're looking at each other as representatives of their characters. You're looking through your character's eyes in the Dungeons and Dragons world that your DM has set up for you and is running. That's how I see the game being in even 5 years or less. We have all the technology to do that right now. We just need a big carrier, one of the big Oculus or something like that, and Steam, for instance, to get onto it and actually support that and grow it. And I think there's a few companies which are headed in that direction right now.
It's very weird you say that, because that actually mirrors a conversation I had in the first episode where literally, like, almost word for word, the exact same sentiment was expressed. And
Right.
so I'm wondering, is this sort of, you know, a common view in the you know, sort of loose network of communities? Is like, do we see a future in, you know, technology? And if that is the way we're heading, then that begs the question, like, you know, does that sort of create a two-tiered system eventually where, you know, people who can't afford this sort of tech, you know, kind of have to play the old way? Like, who knows what's going to happen as technology gets introduced, you know, into any hobby, really. It fundamentally changes how the entire thing works.
Well, you can still run this technology. Like most people these days who are involved in Dungeons and Dragons, first of all, it's a social activity. So I'm talking about online play mainly. But I can see a situation where everybody's sitting around a table. They've had a dinner party or whatever. They've got the Cheetos and the Mountain Dew in the middle of the table. And they're all wearing their cell phones on cardboard goggles on their head. And the DM's got his laptop, and he's running the group of people through whatever scenario it is. The older generation, the baby boomers, looking on going, what is it? What are these people doing? Back in my day, we used to play Dungeons and Dragons with dice. We've got dice. Rattles phone, shows virtual dice. That's not the same. How are you supposed to bless them? Yeah. So it's just evolving. It's headed that way since we first started having Google Hangouts, for instance, and we immediately embraced it to play online play and play with a much wider, broader group of people across the world. So no longer we were restricted to the local group of people who you may have, you know, falling out with and lose contact with, or have people in your group that you don't want to hang out with anymore. Again, it's friendship more than anything. So if your local relationships with people break down, then you're going to be out of the game real quick. But if you are playing primarily over Facebook or something like that, then you've got a much greater pool of people to draw from.
The only issue I see with something like that is, at least, from a American perspective, like the broadband here is, compared to most of the world, quite bad, because we have the telecommunication fiefdoms, essentially.
Yeah, I believe Elon Musk is at the moment launching satellites for third world nations to enable their communication technology, and his plan is to actually provide a worldwide communication network, so actual satellite broadband for everybody, which will be great.
I mean,
I'll believe it when I see it. But
yeah.
There's nothing that terrestrial companies can do about space communications. They cannot compete with his resources. He's got spaceships, man.
Elon Musk is a interesting character in our landscape right now, but
he's a very interesting figurehead. But I think there's some very smart people who are working behind the scenes that we don't know enough about.
Well, here's my reservation with something like that is, like, he did his loop project here in Los Angeles, where he dug the tunnels, to get around, and it just devolved, and it was just poorly planned out, and eventually they just said, all right, it's an underground tunnel for cars now, going back on so much of his original plan. So I'm a little skeptical, because Elon has a history of sort of half-baked ideas. But if it works, that's great.
Or over promotion and getting locked in. It's the same sort of problem you have with network televisions and things like that, where you give executives budgets and then they get freaked out and they cancel series that everybody's in love with, and next thing you know, they're boycotting. They're sitting out on somebody's front lawn protesting a TV show. I laughed so hard when I heard about the people who are upset with the end of Game of Thrones forming a petition. It's like, have you any idea the amount of work that went into that last season?
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to rebuild King's Landing.
Yeah, I mean, from a storyteller's perspective, though, I can definitely see that there was a narrative shift from the early seasons to the later seasons in how they started in being products of the cultural norms that were in, Westeros. And then it later evolved into, they have a end that they want to get to, and they're just sort of working their way to that. So you see,
the one thing I would have done differently on the last season is, instead of Khaleesi riding around on the dragon, I would have had the dragon doing its own thing, and her basically just standing by going, oh, okay. For those of you, spoiler alert, for those of you who haven't seen the last season yet, where have you been? I would have had the dragon actually doing the revenge on its own, because its sibling got killed. The dragon was motivated to destroy King's Landing anyway. Let's not forget that dragons are intelligent and have moods and stuff. Those aren't dragons, though, I should point out, as a professional monster person. Those aren't dragons.
They can't speak. They aren't intelligent.
They've got they're wyverns. They've got wings, and they don't have front legs. They've got just wings and hind legs. That's it. Yeah, dragons have got 6 limbs.
Well, it's like you know what is a wyvern, and people refuse to call it a wyvern. That exists in nerd culture. Is in the game Monster Hunter. There's a creature called a Rathalos, and it's just a wyvern, but nobody will say what it is.
Maybe it's because the word wyvern is just unsatisfying to say. Dragon is a good word to say. Wyvern it's a weird word. It's a wiggly word.
Mm-hmm.
Even Drake is a good word. Well, in Dungeons and Dragons circles.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's a fun question. What are some monsters, that have describable names in D&D terms that you see in our media being, called something else for, For instance, Frankenstein being the original flesh golem.
Probably one of the biggest confusions for people when they join Dungeons and Dragons from outside media is the difference in the depiction of orcs and goblins and hobgoblins and bugbears and gnolls and kobolds and things like that, because they've changed quite a lot over the editions, and they're not the same as Dungeons. Dungeons and Dragons is not the same as Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
And it differs quite a lot between the different editions of play. Like AD&D had quite different definitions of what a kobold was, for instance. So now in 5th edition, everybody knows that it's a draconic creature, but before it was a form of goblin, essentially. And orcs had pig-like faces with snouts. They weren't ape-like at all, and now they are primarily all about their tusks and stuff. And a lot of people depict orcs, even in I think the Acquisitions Incorporated book, depicts orcs as having green skin.
Mm-hmm.
Nope, they don't have green skin. They've got grey skin. But the artists often disagree. Oh, and my major bone of contention with 5th edition, which I think is the worst thing about 5th edition. Are you ready?
Yes.
Halfling's feet.
Oh.
Coming from New Zealand.
As a New Zealander.
As a New Zealander who literally lives not that far from Hobbiton itself, I have a massive bone to pick with Shindy Hedy and the art direction team, who decided to make Hobbit's feet tiny. This is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. Their argument when they came up with this was that if they look at a halfling not standing next to a human, it wasn't distinctive enough. And this is because in 4th edition, they went with these sort of river nomad halflings from the planet Wrath, who had braided hair and sort of a weird elongated skull, which was fine. But again, they didn't emphasize the fact that these they went barefoot and they had large hairy feet. Because if you put a halfling next to anything and it's got large hairy feet as big as its thigh, then it looks like a hobbit. It looks like a halfling. That's a distinctive enough trait. Dwarves are stocky and broad and have got beards. Halflings are round, sort of pudgy, but can be heroic and quite muscular. But they've got these large, hairy feet, and it doesn't need to be any different from that. And that also explains the fact that they walk around very quietly, because they're feeling around with their feet, and they've got a wide dispersal of weight across their foot, which means that they pad around very quietly. So, yeah, I don't like the hobbits in 5th edition.
That's fair enough. Well, kind of branching from that, do you think that the media that gets created sort of influences how the creatures evolve, or do you think that it's D&D that sort of sets the standard, and then through osmosis, that's sort of how the depiction becomes later on?
It's a bit of both, and it feeds into itself in a very subtle way. Because Dungeons & Dragons has been around for such a long time, 4 decades, my entire life, essentially, almost to a year, you can see how it's changed over time and how that has influenced writers who have fed back into the lore of the game, which has changed it even more. So some things remain relatively the same, but other things diverge quite radically. Case in point is Dungeons & Dragons' own intellectual property of the Phoenix, for instance. One of the characters from their cartoon series back in the day was a phoenix bird. And now in 5th edition, the phoenix is a huge fire elemental, quite different from the mythology of phoenixes and anything else, because they essentially needed a large elemental, and they tacked onto it the name Phoenix and gave it a bird shape. So they really just sort of went to sleep on the lore on that one, I think. And I expressed my displeasure in that video on the Phoenix quite a lot.
No, I'm with you on that. That's sort of a bad move.
Yeah. So I can see that as, like, my prediction is, if there is a 6th edition, that would be one of the things which doesn't last, because it's just an unpopular view. It's an unpopular addition to the game. And I don't think that's going to influence people's writing of future stuff. On the other hand, the work that's gone on to into Mordecai and Somaphos that further defined hags and beholders, and particularly elves, elven culture and elven spirituality and elven life cycles and that sort of stuff, that will definitely have a very big impact on the game going forward. So it's almost pointless fighting against the fact that elves reincarnate and remember their past lives in the early years of their life, for instance. That is compelling lore that is going to influence future writers of the game heavily, I think. So that sort of thing really, for somebody who studied the history of the game, I can see that being a pivotal point, a milestone where the culture of that particular type of creature and the gaming perspective, the gaming psyche, the zeitgeist of of all the role players around the world, that has shifted and changed. It's been influenced by that writing.
Interesting. Well, here, we're going to take a short break, and then when we get back, we'll continue this conversation we have, and I would like to move the conversation from monsters to the worlds they inhabit, if that's all right with you.
Oh, fine.
All right, so now that we're back, I would like to ask you, what are your favorite settings in the D&D world? There have been so many created, Dark Sun, Spelljammer, Planescape, Greyhawk, all that. What are your particular favorites, and more so, like, what do they do that enraptures you?
So I actually do a lot of homebrew. I don't typically run a lot of Faerun in my own home games all the time. I'll run a stretch of Faerun for like a year or so, and then I'll branch off, usually into even another gaming system. I played Fantasy Age for a while, and then I got back to playing Faerun again, and then we branched off into a more homebrew sort of thing where we were on an entirely made-up world called Sithrun, and now we're playing a completely freewheeling game where I'm not doing any world building at all. I'm letting the characters run the story and building the world as they go through it, which is an entirely different type of gaming philosophy, like the no world builds game, where you don't actually do any campaign planning at all. You just run completely reactively to what players are doing, which is great for an exploration game because it makes it very interesting to dungeon master that game as well, because you don't know what's happening next either. Obviously, I'm very focused on Forgotten Realms and Spelljammer and Planescape. Those are my meat and potatoes. And using just those three systems, those three settings, you can run a complete fantasy game, including space fantasy, cosmic fantasy, and everything in between. Added onto that is the concept of different dimensions, different alternate planes of existence, which comes in from Planescape. And of course, with that comes the fact that you've got the Prime Material universe, which, if you're following the Planescape setting and Spelljammer as a combined thing, it makes this really cohesive cosmology where each world is within a crystal sphere, and the crystal sphere has got a space within it that operates in fantasy sort of rules, not like our regular sort of vacuum. It's quite distinctive and different. So you can literally play on a flying sort of pirate ship going through space to asteroids and things, and having fights with other, Githyanki vessels and things like that, high above planets and things, and go all these different locations and preserve that sort of space sci-fi fantasy feel to it. You can run a sort of Star Wars game that way. And Combine that with the fact that magic exists. So magic has portals and gateways and the ability to commune with creatures from other planes of existence, other realities. And at the far end of those realities, as they diverge greatly away from the possibilities that are around you, you end up with the far realm, which has got completely different laws of physics and things. And it's a dimension of madness that we can't really comprehend very well because it doesn't operate the same way that everything that we're familiar with does. And as you get progressively closer in the probabilities to the here and now, you get alternate planes of existence where other versions of beings exist and things. So you've got this flip side of reality, which is the Feywild, which is it's a borderland of dream between here and the astral plane, where fantasy and storytelling and stuff sort of combine to make these, the Fey creatures and fairy tales and Baba Yaga and all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Then on the other side of that, as we head towards entropy and the other side of the scale, we've got the Shadowfell and realms of shadow, and we've got Ravenloft and all these sort of dark places. And so it all exists in this delicate balance of these intervening transient planes that we can get from A to B through, which are their own destinations as well. And then you've got the upper planes, which are all these realms of imagination and mythology, and the lower planes, which are also mythology. And that forms this structure of feeding back into, and the reason why the prime material exists is to provide a breeding ground for souls and things, which provide the framework for this system of feeding back into each other and on and whatever. And there's a lot of mystery involved in it, and it's very, very compelling for people to set stories and wonder about it, because it's a complete mythology and ecology of a universe, a multiverse, which is where we set all of our stories. So Dark Sun and all those other sort of, Dark Sun and Narath for 4th edition, Kryn, the Dragonlance world, and Mystara, where Dungeons and Dragons basic game was set for a great many years. And we can even slip in outside of the realm of possibilities. Now we've got Ravnica, which is the Magic the Gathering universe, which exists in an entirely different multiverse, which has been shoehorned into the game somewhat. And I like it. I really like that idea that we can just grab anything and pop it into Dungeons and Dragons as an alternate universe or a different dimension or a different sphere with different planets and things in there. So, for instance, in Netflix is going to be playing a new series of The Dark Crystal and the world Thra, which is, I think, a perfect breeding ground for another Dungeons and Dragons module. So we could adapt Thra to be a world for Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition easily.
Mm-hmm.
Just drag it and drop it right into the cosmology. It fits everything. It's a plug and play. I guess I've got settings that I'm more familiar with and settings which I'm not familiar with yet, but I'll get around to because people ask me questions about things and I end up researching them. I don't have a lot of interest in Ravenloft. I don't have a lot of interest in Dark Sun because I haven't played those traditionally. And I'm not part of a gaming group or a social network of people who like playing those games. So I'm unlikely to be focused on it as something that I'm actively doing. I'll be focusing on it just for research, which is less personal. I don't have much of a vested interest in it myself, sort of thing. But I've still got more familiarity with those settings probably than quite a few people, just through osmosis, through reading wiki pages and things, and picking up bits and pieces of information which gel together eventually. But they're not my main focus. My main focus is the Forgotten Realms and the world of Toril.
Okay.
Oh, and Greyhawk, obviously.
Greyhawk's classic.
Yeah.
Just to clear things up, because some of my listeners might not be familiar with the terminology you're throwing around, is just for the sake of it, distinctify, what the difference between a plane and a world is, because, it really boils down to how Spelljammer and Planescape play differently.
So you could say that a world is somewhere that you can go physically from A to B. So the worlds of the prime material universe are all reachable from each other through physical means. You don't have to use magic to get there. A plane of existence, on the other hand, is an entirely different dimension that you need to travel through some sort of means of magic to get there. And that's represented in, I'm trying to think of like popular particular culture. Let's say you go to Asgard, for instance. So Thor has activated the Bifrost Bridge, and a beam of rainbow energy has come down, and they've teleported away. They've actually traveled to a different plane of existence where different physical laws and things follow. So Asgard is another world above and beyond in a different plane of existence. So an entirely different universe with different things happened at the Big Bang, and it's split off. That probability split off, and this is the many worlds theory. Like, so for every decision you make, it makes another reality where something else could have happened, and it doesn't really matter how realistic that is. Story wise, it works. So we're not talking about real world physics, we're talking about fantasy and make believe. And how do we fit our popular media how do we fit the stories that we want to tell into this gaming system that we have? And this is the system that we've developed.
Okay, interesting. With that, like, now that we have sort of an idea of, what the differences are, the system of D&D has the Great Wheel cosmology, all the different planes of existence that make up what is considered the standard array of D&D planes. So of those, what do you think outside of the prime material offers the most narrative potential for a hypothetical party?
So I personally like starting off in the city of Sigil, the city of doors, because it's a hub that allows you to go anywhere. And it's got its own intrigue as well. So it's this ultimate seedy Mos Eisley network of a ramshackle of all sorts of different species from across the universe. It's a very Stargate sort of feel to it. So it's Dungeons and Dragons Stargate. So you can go anywhere through these portals and things, except there's no foundation or political group which is running the show. It's your local haberdashery has got a series of portals and things in their own little network, and sordid crime scene going on. And it all sort of, it's just organized chaos that plays off against each other. And I like that freedom to let the players just explore and get themselves into all sorts of shenanigans. I don't personally believe that you should restrict any sort of movement or play style to any particular level of play. I think it's up to the dungeon master to make things fair and equitable, but also allow players to get into situations which are scary for their characters, above their pay grade, so to speak. But don't automatically make things lethal to them, because they're literally beneath the notice of large and powerful forces and factions and beings. Just like you don't go out of your way to swat every fly you see. So I think Planescape is the best medium for that, and I think it's the best established framework. It's got a very well supported information. If people want to research Wikipedia and things like that, Planescape information and Forgotten Realms information is very well supported. So you can combine those two to go pretty much anywhere, and then go to the different planes of existence. The thing with the planes of existence above and beyond, like if you're going to Asgard or Olympus or Mount Celestia and all these different places, the Nine Hells, etc., they are well established as locations, but they're not established exceedingly well as fixed maps with stuff going on there the same all the time. So you are quite free to go there and say, okay, this is what the mythology of my particular Thor or Odin is, and this is the particular type of Asgard that I want to have in my game, and you are free to create that as you see fit. So whatever your idea of Asgard is, that's the Asgard that you run for your players, and that's perfectly fine.
I think that's kind of the beauty of a lot of D&Ds, that it creates so much, yet leaves so much open for, more to be built on by each particular person and their group.
Yeah.
But here's a question, because you are from what I see, you seem to be someone who likes to create very big stories, very cosmic stories. But how do you do that without making the players feel small or over insignificant?
I make it completely optional. So the big stories, I think the key is you focus on what the characters are doing. You always pay attention to the fact that the players are there to develop their character, to tell their character's story. Your story is secondary to that. That's the background tapestry that they can choose to engage with or not. And one of the mistakes is to believe that the story in your background, your world, must carry on without the character's involvement, whether they choose to get involved with it or not. So saying that this army is invading this land and it's in 5 days it's going to invade and crush the city unless the players do anything about it. That's not how I run the game. How I run the game is when the characters engage with that aspect of the story, that's when it progresses or stops. So it just sort of sits in limbo until they re-engage with it again. If they're not interested, that way they can just come back to it when they feel like it, and things sort of carry on that way. And it tends to work. So I play the game as set pieces that are in place that I can drop into the game whenever it becomes relevant. So the story is not dependent on certain encounters. The encounters are just sort of a sliding thing that can just drop in. It's something cool that I want to see happen. So that's how I decide what an encounter is going to be. It's like, you know what would be cool? And then I jot down some notes, and then I make a scenario, an environment out of it. And then I drop it into the game as soon as I can and let the players experience my enthusiasm for it. And I describe it, and they get to experience their version of what I've imagined. And that's how I run my game. So I have big cosmic stuff going on, sure, but it's never independent of what the characters are doing.
Sounds good. Here's my last question, and then we're going to start wrapping things up. Mm-hmm. So this is how I like to close it, is as a DM, what is, in your mind, the most important thing someone can take away from a session?
A funny story that they can tell later on. That's it.
I mean, it's curtain to the point, so I completely respect that.
Yeah, essentially, if one of the things, if I could expand on it a bit and have another bit of a gripe about, and I'm not criticizing the particular playstyle, like non-lethal playstyle is definitely a thing, and you can have just as many interesting anecdotes and stuff from non-lethal playstyle. For instance, pets and things like that, nostalgia and the love that people have for animal companions and familiars and things like that. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is and how overjoyed I was to see that the D&D Essentials kit that they've released has got animal companions built into it. That is essential because it's great. It's really easy to get players engaged. They will go crazy and turn into bloodthirsty hooligans if their pet raccoon is threatened. That's all the motivation they need. They can ignore everything, wealth, power, fame, everything. But if, Bubbles the raccoon is threatened by anything, they go ballistic. Anyway, what I was going to get back to is lethality. Quite a few of my best stories are about how a particular character died in the game. And I think it's a mistake to feel like you need to cushion players from traumatic events in the game, because these quite often cement in their memory. They go back and they stew it over and they think about it, and it becomes fleshed out, and then becomes an anecdote of what are your favorite. You can ask any old school gamer, what are your favorite character deaths? And they'll talk about particularly gruesome, unfair or heroic demises of their characters as some of their favorite memories that they've cherished for years. And of course, running jokes that you have during game sessions, which I think in some ways the broadcast style of play encourages, but in other ways I think also discourages out of gameplay running gags and jokes. For example, in Critical Role, how one of the players would wear a shirt with Matt Mercer's face on it, or his own face replicated over and over again in different series of shirts. You can have conversation versions of that. So in my gaming group, for instance, me and my best mate Ian will say hydrogen gas, and that's a running gag that's been going for 6 years, to the point where I don't even remember how it started. And also, if a player is missing from a session and they come back and they say, how many fingers did I lose? That is directly related to something that happened in the game that was actually a massive argument and caused a person to leave our gaming group. But it's now become a running gag. Yeah, it's become a running gag. It's like, how many fingers do I lose if I'm away from the game for 2 days? So that sort of thing is my favorite. The fact that you get this language, this jargon between your good friends that are related to memories that you've formed together, which other people don't understand. It's like movies that you've seen that nobody else has seen because they're all in your head. Can I relate my favorite ever gaming session?
Sure,
Have
why
we got
not?
time? Have we got time?
Oh, we've got
So
plenty
this
of
is,
time.
oh, great. So this was a random happenstance that was caused by a player who was a worshipper of a trickster god. He was a cleric of a trickster god. And he decided to pull the wool over his own trickster god's eyes. And this trickster god pulled the wool over his eyes by springing an interdimensional trap on him, basically making sure that he discovered this trap that had been left behind. And I used the dark crystal as the seed of this idea, that the fact that this broken crystal had in fact shattered reality as well. So they went into this corridor, which led to a junction, which had 8 other corridors coming off it. And each one of those corridors was connected to a different alternate reality where different versions of them, where different events had happened, were coming down the corridor from the opposite direction, investigating in their universe what this thing was at the same time. And my favorite part of that gaming session was me sitting back as the dungeon master doing nothing for a good 10 minutes as the players around the table were talking in character to alternate versions of their character. They were even having conversations entirely by themselves in character to other characters, other versions of their characters, figuring out what was going on. It was great. I was just sitting back. They were completely immersed for a good solid 10 minutes before any one of them looked up and asked me a question. And I was just sitting back, just marveling, and also terrified because it was getting so confusing. That we ran the very real risk of characters wandering off and getting replaced by alternate universe characters. There's a movie actually called Convergence, which covers the story as this idea as well. So I recommend watching The Dark Crystal in Convergence, and you'll understand how an interdimensional alternate reality trap can work. Eventually, though, they found the crystal chamber and they put the shard back into the crystal. It snapped all of the realities back to just a corridor that connected back to their own reality again, and they all wandered out again. But there was a very real chance that some of those characters didn't originally belong in that universe. And that was my favorite. That was my favorite gaming session.
Well, that's beautiful, and and really, thank you for taking the time to meet with me, and thank you for giving onto us your wisdom. I guess we'll see you around, and it's been good talking with you.
Good talking to you too, man. I'm looking forward to your other interviews with other YouTubers.